Hello and welcome back to Designing and Building Custom Apps Using Dynamics 365 for Customer Engagement, Volume 1. So in this section, we're going to cover the extension points that are available to us in JavaScript, and we're going to step up a gear a bit and make our project ready to develop much more complicated scripts than we've done already in this course. And then we're going to look at calling the SDK web services from JavaScript, which is a topic which has changed quite remarkably in the recent years. And then we're going to look at command bar customization, so adding in custom commands to our command bar in forms and views, and then look at grid extensions and what notifications we can add to a form. Let's now take a look at the considerations we need to make when we're implementing logic and when we're deciding whether or not it should be on the client or on the server. Well, we've talked quite a lot about business rules and all the things that it can do so far, like setting fields, clearing fields, setting required levels. But there's probably going to be a point where you will find that business rules are not actually going to do what you need to do. There are some simple limitations, like it can't hide tabs and sections. You'd have to hide the individual fields, and if there's a lot of fields in that section, then that can be a bit of a pain. But also there are other limitations, such as it can't get values from related entities. So if you have a lookup, it can't get a value from that lookup. It can't do queries against other Dynamics entities. And then there's some comparison limitations as well. So you can only compare fields where the types are exactly the same. So for example, if you had a date time field and one of them was user local and another was time zone independent, you wouldn't actually be able to do any comparisons on those fields. And then there's obviously some branching limitations that the business rule designer only allows you to do very simple if then. You can't add more complicated or combinations. So at a certain point, you're going to start to look at comparing your business rules with the advantages of moving to form JavaScript. Now, obviously, we're looking at immediate feedback here. So this is all happening on the client. Of course, there's maybe sometimes when there's some validation you want to add, and actually it happens so infrequently that doesn't really justify adding it to the form JavaScript. But what we're looking at here is something where the user is regularly doing something, and we want to make it as efficient as possible. So in this case, we're looking at the booking form. And we want to be able to add some functionality to the booking form to make it quick whilst they're talking to a customer, to get that immediate feedback rather than having to save the record and then waiting for the error message to come back, as we've seen already. The business rules work on all clients. JavaScript, you're going to have to start to be slightly wary of what limitations there are going to be or where your JavaScript's running. But I tend to look at this from a perspective of, if we can do everything through business rules, well, that's great. But as soon as we get to combine JavaScript and business rules, not project-wide, but on an individual entity basis, then I start to say, well, let's try and move all of that functionality into JavaScript rather than making the combination, because you can sometimes get some strange interactions between the two. And not least the fact that once you put your JavaScript logic into a TypeScript file and a TypeScript project, you can then search it very easily. Whereas if you've got logic that's spread across between business rules and your TypeScript, it's going to be very difficult to actually know the complete surface area. So when we're looking at client-side validation, then business rules are a great choice, because it will actually also run on the server if possible. And we've looked at before where you set the scope of a business rule to be entity. If you're not using a business rule, then you need to think about, well, okay, we've got the JavaScript running on the client, but if it was previously an entity business rule, we need to then also create that functionality on the server using, for example, real-time workflows or plugins. So do bear in mind that the total cost of ownership as soon as you move away from business rules is going to be quite a lot higher, because you'll have to have functionality that's duplicated effectively. There will be an increase in complexity, because whenever you change some logic on the client, you'll also have to go and change the logic on the server. Before you move to JavaScript for calculated fields, it's worthwhile considering the customization options for adding a calculated field which will be evaluated on the server in real time when you request the value. Now, this is very different to if you're running in JavaScript, where as I respond to an on-change event of another field, it would then run that calculation. Calculated fields don't actually have a stored value in the database, which makes them very efficient. But really crucially, The important difference here is that if you were running this calculation in JavaScript, it would mean that that value would be stored historically. Whereas if it's a calculated field and you change the calculation, then there's going to be no historical calculation stored. Every time you request that value, it's going to have a new calculated value using the latest formula. So this is a really important consideration when you move from the client side to the server side with this logic. Likewise, with real-time workflows, you can do very similar calculations on the server. However, this would do more like where you had JavaScript, where it will actually respond to an on-change event. And then, of course, you've always got plugins which would do very similar. Again, would be calculating a value and then storing it in a database field, so it'll be historically correct. Rollup fields are another topic. Now, again, this is about deciding on what kind of client-side behavior or server-side behavior you want to implement. If we were to do a rollup field in JavaScript, then this would mean that I would have to go and do a query using the SDK web services and respond to a particular event. Now, that may be a grid changing, and we're going to look at later on how to respond to grid events. We could then go and calculate a sum of a particular monetary value and then show the updated value in real time as it changes, whereas a rollup field is always going to run on a scheduled basis. So again, this is a really important consideration, whether or not we want to show something immediately as the data changes on the client, or can we rely on something being run on the server. Now, the bulk job that runs for rollup fields is incredibly efficient, so that's definitely always going to be a consideration there. You may have a very large number of records, and if you're going to have to download and do the aggregation on the client, that could be a bit of a problem. But if you did need to have a server-side rollup, but you couldn't do it on a schedule basis, you didn't want to have to wait every hour for the rollup calculation to happen, then the only other option is having a plugin which would respond to the changes of the client, sending the update to the server, and then the server would then detect that change and then run that plugin, which would then run the aggregate query.